Hey, welcome to the program. My name's Sean. Today, we're going to talk about one of the greatest civilizations in all of history, ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt is so awesome because it's like the rock star of the ancient world, right? If, you know, One of the main reasons why is this. All of these old civilizations around the world, they used a lot of different materials, right, to make their dwellings. Mud brick, for instance, in Asia, and then parts of Mesopotamia. And that breaks down over time, so it doesn't exist. We might find piles of stuff, or maybe they wandered into caves and we can see some cave drawings. I personally saw some really cool Neolithic period cave art when I was on a trek through this wilderness area in South Africa. But as far as like a city and civilizations, you need to use stone, man, if you want that to last for thousands and thousands a year or eternity. And the ancient Egyptians literally built these pyramids so they could last forever. And so the civilization started about 3100 BC, right? It was spread out South Egypt, North Egypt, um, along the Nile River on the Fertile Crescent there in North Africa. But when it came together as like the ancient Egyptian society, as we know, about 3100 BC, which is about 5,100 years ago, like over 5,000 years ago. And that civilization lasted for 3,000 years. That's crazy. 3,000 years makes the Roman Empire look like junior varsity. And us, we're only like 250 years old ish or more. I can't actually ever do math when I'm on this microphone. So it's extraordinary because of all the evidence of life and culture and magic and religion and buildings and structures that they left behind. It tells such a magnificent story. And just if we want to picture Egypt before we get into the drug use in ancient Egypt, when you think of the pyramids, everybody sees them on TV or on the internet somewhere. They're just like piles of rocks and rubble. And there's so many conspiracy theories. Oh, the aliens came down. They had a special technology. And they did have special technology. I'll mention a little bit of something in a minute. However, it didn't look like that. They actually brought in limestone from a quarry across the Nile in Torah. And we know this because in 2014, we found an ancient papyrus, which is a huge scroll, which was literally the guy managing the project from Torah's limestone mines, where they cut the stones for the pyramids, to Khufu's pyramid, which is the big pyramid of Giza, right? And Khufu's brother, I don't know his name, he was kind of in charge of the operation. So we know that this papyrus was talking about the stones going to Khufu's pyramid because it mentioned Khufu's brother in it. And the guy that was in charge was literally writing on that papyrus a daily blog. Like day one, traveled from Torah with X amount of stones, met Khufu's brother in the pool of Khufu, right? So we already know they were moving these giant stones across the Nile to build, right? How they got it up, there's a lot of debate about that, but we'll talk about a couple of those things. But what I want you to picture is those pyramids were not piles of stones like we see them today. In fact, most of the limestone that was on the outside was taken away and destroyed over the centuries to help build Cairo. So somewhere in people's houses and homes and neighborhoods in Cairo, their foundations are essentially built out of the Pyramid of Giza and the other pyramids that were there. There's over 100 pyramids. We talk about a couple of them, Khufu's, which is the big one, and then Khafre, which is his son, I believe. So these pyramids were covered in smooth limestone, which was bright white, which would glare off the sun. And then evidence shows at the top of them, there was some kind of like gold lacquer at the very point of it. So you had this bright white pyramid with like a gold nipple on top that just shined when the sun came down. It just glowed like so they could look like they were gods. And that was the whole point of it. So when we see them today, they're a little dilapidated. They're like brownish, oranges, piles of rocks, but they were just these brilliant white masterpieces. And then in all the other cities like Saqqara or Luxor, when you see these giant obelisks or the remnants of walls and towers that have all these hieroglyphs on them, they were all color. So is this like giant glowing city with lots of color all over the place. And I just can't imagine what it looked like. So I went to the Met Museum in New York City like a month ago. It was like over the holiday break here, which was crazy because it was so packed. I wish I went at another time. However, they have over 30,000 ancient Egypt artifacts there. I mean, if you love Egypt and you're anywhere near the Met, go there. I could have spent days there, and you're touching stuff like some of these old like statues of Ramses, and you're not supposed to touch. I got yelled at a million times, but if you put something that's 5,000 years old right next to me, I'm going to touch it and look at it real close because it's, I don't know, it just appeals to me. So ancient Egypt was influenced by Mesopotamia. So you'd have to go all the way up the Nile, all the way around the sea to Iraq, right? So modern day Iraq is kind of where Mesopotamia was, which included like Samaria, then the city of Urk in Uruk. And these are famous ancient cities. And there are remnants of life there, lots of pottery and jugs and signs of trade and artwork, but they don't have the structures like ancient Egypt because they weren't building them the same way. But what we do know and why it's relevant to this conversation about drugs in ancient Egypt is that Mesopotamia, they were rocking on the poppy, opium, early on. So sometime about 5,000 years ago, there is evidence of pottery and remnants and images of the poppy plant and the use of opium in Mesopotamia. So when Egypt then established itself as we know it as ancient Egypt about 3100 BC, 5,000-ish years ago, they started trade routes, right? And it wasn't just them, it was the Assyrians and later on the Akkadians, and they had significant trade of spices and things that would influence Egyptian society. And that would include opium, right? So we know that ancient Egyptians knew exactly the purpose of opium, even though some scholars say, no, there's no sign they used it recreationally as a drug. I call bullshit because the translation of the word, and I can't say it, it's Holgil, right? From ancient Mesopotamia, literally translates to joy plant. How do you know it brings you joy if you weren't taking the milk of the poppy plant, right? The little juice that comes out, which is, we know from other episodes, mostly morphine, also codeine, and you powder it down to opium. So we know they knew it brought joy and sleep and rest. Okay, so it moves into ancient Egypt about 3100 BC. And here's the evidence, right? The evidence is one, there's a big piece of evidence. So the Ebers Papyrus was found, right? It was a giant, it's like a giant scroll, and it talked about the uses of the poppy plant, what it was used for. And some of the uses were putting people to sleep, making a crying baby feel better, right? Trying to numb the pain. And some translations in that papyrus talk about like depression and mental anguish and using it for that. So if you put together what the society stood for, right? How it was so like mythical and magical and glowing and colorful, and then you introduce some sort of psychoactive substance like opium that's going to make you feel high and joy, and you add it into that context, it's likely they did use it recreationally. Imagine building Khufu's pyramid, spending like a 20-hour workday, and like, man, I sure could use a little bit of milk of the poppy, right? I love saying that. That's from Game of Thrones, like milk of the poppy, and that's the opium. But we don't know. No one's documenting that like Charles the Egyptian was like, had to go to rehab for his opium addiction. But we know it was there. The evidence is in the papyrus. That's one medical use, right? More evidence is on all the great wall art I just talked about earlier that the Egyptians left behind. The use of the poppy seed in some of these images is just so prevalent. And the way it's displayed is, yeah, sure, ceremonial, spiritual, magical, but it's still the use of the drug. And also, there was some vases found, some old pottery that were shaped like the poppy plant, that within it, they found the alkaloids of the poppy plant. And some believe that it even had like liquid traces for morphine. So that was found in the tomb of Ka. So all this evidence is found that it existed. It is highly unlikely that a society had access to something that was so joyful that it didn't seep out into the regular activities, behaviors, habits, and lives of the people of ancient Egypt, right? And with the trade route, Mesopotamia could tell them exactly how to use it and what to do. So one of the rabbit holes I am going down, because every society had like this opium presence, right? So they were using the poppy plant. Where did it come from? Now we could just say, poof, God said it's right there. Possible. But I was trying to find the first humans that were using it. And as you go down research papers in depths, they find something, then something else comes up. So there's a couple research articles that say it was coming from like the Asia region. But more recently, I found some research that they found evidence of cultivation and growth in the Swiss Alps. Like you wouldn't even think about that for poppy, right? So it's adaptable. I learned it can grow in many environments, but they found it in the northern Mediterranean, Spain, and Italy, and all the way up to the Alps. So those were carbon dated, the materials around it, and some of the seed chars itself to like almost 8,000 years ago. So that's totally Neolithic period. We'll come back to you on that. But as far as ancient Egypt and the opium, they were doing it. Just another society that did it. Tons of evidence. King Ramses II had you know what? I said that wrong. That's marijuana. Let's skip that. I'm trying to wing this a little bit. So if we think about it, drugs in ancient Egypt include opium. Drugs in ancient Egypt also include the weed, man. Were they smoking the weed? Probably. There's a lot of evidence of seeds in the same types of pottery where incense was burned. So whether it was ceremonial, just like the opium, maybe it was ceremonial, but that doesn't mean that people didn't feel the effects and go home and be like, yo, dude, after you build that pyramid, we got to go get high on this shit, right? So there's tons of evidence of cannabis there. And they were also using it, right, the hemp to make rope, right? And those ropes were helping to pull those blocks to make the pyramids. I promised a little bit of special technology evidence for the pyramid. I think it was in, oh God, I'm so bad with all the Egyptian names. It was the Step Pyramid. It was the first one, Djoser, right? The first one that built the pyramid. I believe it was Djoser. And they like, at first they were going to build it with mud bricks. They're like, no, we need stone. And that's how they really figured out how to use like these big stones and bring in limestone and make this thing last forever. But they left a hole in the top to drop down like a 40,000 ton sarcophagus that they were going to put him in, which coincidentally was robbed, but the sarcophagus is in there. So after investigating this step pyramid, what they found, this is remarkable. So when people say, oh, how they build the pyramids, what technology they use, this is the kind of shit they came up with. So when you don't have TV, internet, social media, plans with the in-laws on Friday, shows to binge, you can sit around and think about how we're going to build these giant megalithic structures for the gods, right? So they lower this by filling that hole with sand. And then they built 2 channels they found with the same sand all the way down the side that went out. And so what they did is they'd raise those levers up and they let the sand run out. Well, this giant fucking tomb just lowered down, like an amazing engineering feat for just using sand. So if they could lower a sarcophagus of that size and weight with sand so perfectly, and if you look at images, you can look at it's just settled perfectly. Like then they could figure out ways to put those giant 80,000 ton blocks of limestone and other materials that were on like the Khufu thing. And it's likely they probably just had like 1,000 people pulling it, maybe 2,000 people pulling it, but that's for another show. So the cannabis use is also depicted in the wall art, in the hieroglyphics, and it's in the tomb. Multiple people have been buried with the cannabis like flowers as their headdress. Like this is where Ramses, they found the alkaloids of it all over his burial shroud, right? So it was definitely ceremonial. It was definitely part of their mythical, magical element. But again, when there's a drug in society that has a purpose, just like our society, right? OxyContin wasn't for recreational, it was for medical use. Yet somehow whoa, this shit's good. Everybody's using it. And that's likely what happened to societies back then. Now, also in ancient Egypt, I went down the rabbit hole of looking at a flower called, it's a water lily that grew out naturally on the Nile called the blue lotus. And if you look online or go on YouTube, you'll see like, ooh, the blue lotus will make you trip out, and it's crazy. The ancient Egyptians had these wild drugs. Egyptians had this wild drug, and not so much. So that's what I believed. So when I actually went to the Met, one of my like personal tasks was looking for how many different places in the wall art and different tombs and throughout the dynasties. Because you walk in there, you start at like, 5,000 years ago and you go up to 3,000 years ago. So when did it start being depicted? When did it start coming in color? And what were the uses of this blue lotus flower? Because I heard it was a crazy psychedelic. And it turns out it's not a psychedelic. And you might see the blue lotus with a family, right? On wall art or in a tomb. You might see the blue lotus dried on the ceremonial dress of garments of someone being buried. You see it all the time on the wall. But then when you start seeing the blue lotus up like this and they're sniffing it, now we're getting into some weird shit. So there's a papyrus out there that's just crazy. It shows all these people sniffing the blue lotus. And then there's like this weird dude with a giant boner, man. Like giant. And then there's like another dude underneath him. I'm going to try to post a picture, but the papyrus is all like, it was like ripped and destroyed. So it's really hard to see. I don't think you'll get a good look at it, but you should certainly Google it. And it shows that we're using the blue lotus as like an aphrodisiac or ceremonial. And then these other images are showing the ancient Egyptians dipping the blue lotus into wine. So now you got this like psychosomatic state of, we've got the blue lotus flower, we're engaged in sex acts, and we've got wine. So it was spiritual and ceremonial and sexual. But then along came some researchers and scientists to poo-poo the idea of the blue lotus. And what they did is they took a blue lotus out of one of the tombs from ancient Egypt. Then they went to a like botanical garden, I think in Europe, and they took a modern day blue lotus, right, which is the same flower. The first thing they did was compare them, right? Compare all the scientific details and breakdown and molecular structure of them. And they're identically the same. They didn't find any significant differences. But now what they also found was there was no narcotic properties in this flower whatsoever. However, there was a very high concentrate of ginkgo biloba, right? So that you could use for different purposes. And if you use it consistently over time, just to promote general ease and peace and other ailments. But when you have such a high amount, they believed it could have been used as some type of Viagra stimulant. And that's why we're seeing it depicted in some of these sex displays. So the blue lotus, drug, not a drug, used as a drug. Yeah, it sounds fun. Sounds like they had some good times with it, but people also looked at it as just a flower of vitality and life, and it's symbolized in various ways. So ancient Egypt, cool place, awesome. I need to go there. I can't believe I haven't been to Egypt. Like, I feel like I do Google Earth. This is like some nerd stuff here. I will sit on my couch and just go into Google Earth and like down to the Pyramid of Giza and zoom in like I'm on a tour. And I'll do that at different places in the world. It's super cool, but you really get an idea of it. You really get an idea of just how massive these pyramids were and what kind of like unbelievable stuff they were doing and thinking about back then. Also in this research, going down, looking at Ramses II and traces of marijuana on his in his tomb and on his what they wrapped him in and it, when he was mummified, it turns out he built these like 460-foot statues of himself. They love to build statues of themselves. I mean, they love that shit. And it was in South Egypt. Like, so if you think about where the Sudan is today. So as anybody was coming into Egypt along the Nile, they would see this giant entrance with these giant statues of Ramses II. And listen how fascinating this is. I did not know this. In like the 1950s, when they were doing the construction of like the Suez Canal, there was other aquatic engineering stuff going on too. They're like, the land's desert. we need a giant reservoir. So while we're doing this, let's just back up the Nile, fill out this whole area. We'll call it a reservoir, a lake. But when they were doing it with the help of the Russians, they just neglected that it was about to bury forever stuff like that Ramses statue at the entrance. And then there was all kinds of other stuff. There's dozens of antiquities and artifacts that are thousands of years old that they were just going to drown. And when the water hits that over time and the erosion, they'll be gone forever. So the rest of the world stepped up and was like, don't do this. Give us a minute. We'll raise some money. So what they did is they went into a bunch of these areas where these statues and stuff were, and they took them apart and they marked them. I mean, and it was an under. They had to build cofferdams to stop the water from coming in because the Russians and the Egyptians, they never stopped filling the water. Like, whatever, you guys do what you want. So they had to like come in and build cofferdams to protect themselves. They were going against the clock to try to get it out. And they started taking these things apart. And the particular one of Ramses II, they actually moved it 200 feet higher and just rebuilt the entire structure. And it was like there was a giant cave you could go into. So they just brought in a manufactured cave out of all the local rock. And you should look at, like, just to see what they did is amazing. But a lot of the countries that helped out, Egypt was like, hey, take something, have a little something for yourselves. Yeah, take a little something home, a little grab bag. So in the Met, which I didn't know at the time, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And I looked at it, but it was crowded. I didn't go in. There's a section there that they actually pulled out of that area. And I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to. But it was just another dwelling with like all the hieroglyphs, the walls, a tower. And you walk in and there's a giant pool at this room of the Met, which was trying to represent, here it is at the base of the Nile. I did not know at the time, but it's crazy that they were just going to let all that stuff go. And they did. They lost so much stuff, but some of it was able to be saved. I'm not sure what that has to do with drugs in Egypt, but I just love this area. And I think one thing we should wrap up to consider about ancient Egypt, there was no camels. It's not like we think about it today. It was not fully a desert. In fact, it was palm trees with lush green. So we talked about these giant, bright white, perfect pyramids with gold shining tops and colorful hieroglyphics and these giant obelisks with all these hieroglyphs and drawings on it. But it was also green and colorful, and there were flowers and like King Tut, right? King Tut's the most famous because, you know what? He was one of the only tombs that hadn't been robbed over the centuries. So we got to see all the great stuff that came out of his tomb. Like, whoa, he's amazing. So everybody knows King Tut. But during his dynasty, he was actually cultivating a shitload of poppy and cannabis. So listen, the more we get on ancient Egypt, the more we go down the rabbit hole, we're starting to see, and the more technology, actually, they're doing stuff today to test for alkaloids that they just couldn't do 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I'm certain in the future, this story will change, it will evolve, and it will develop. But another thing that I think most people that love history that know about these ancient civilizations is they all drank beer. So it wasn't that special. But in Egypt, they've uncovered some crazy looking breweries that still exist because they use stone and not mud brick. And they also were able to ferment alcohol. And they learned this process also from the Mesopotamians, right? Which is kind of like the cradle of civilization. And we say that because it's the first city we found. But they have all the evidence of all these substances, but they kind of were the ones that we believe invented like pottery. Instead of using stone as a bowl, now we have actual clay pottery. So now you can ferment alcohol and do a better job with barley, wheat, and hops to make beer. So as they taught the other civilizations how to do it, ancient Egypt came on board. And so there was tons and tons of alcohol consumption in ancient Egypt, but all these societies put alcohol in their water because their water could kill you. They didn't have filtration systems. There was so much bacteria. In fact, one of the number one killers of people in ancient Egypt were like worms and bacteria in your stomach, which was still an issue in the 1990s, I found out in Egypt. And I guess what the treatment for that was. The joy plant, opium, it's in the Everest papyrus. But you put the booze in the water because it takes the contamination out. So a lot of people were always walking around drinking a lot. Were they shit-faced, putting their arms around each other, singing songs about the pyramids and the god of Horus? Maybe. But they were drinking. they were token, and they were getting some of that poppy, milk of the poppy going hardcore. So I love ancient Egypt. Feel free to email me. And then let me just say this. Thank you for all you people that are listening. I just did this because I have all this shit in my head. But literally, it's not millions or thousands, but there's hundreds of people listening to this on Spotify. And even our Instagram, we launched, it's all of a sudden we have like hundreds and hundreds of followers. So I appreciate it. Spread the word. The more we do this, the better I'll get at delivering the story of drugs in societies over history. So I'll catch you next time. Feel free to email me anytime, historyondrugspodcast@gmail.com. Take it easy.